Hello and welcome to the next of our full course lectures. We're now getting into the detail of the Corporate Governance Code. So we're looking first of all at the Board of Directors. So starting with a little bit of background about the Board of Directors, early reports, remember we mentioned these in our introduction to corporate governance. The Cadbury report related to the Board of Directors, and in the Cadbury report we had the split of the CEO and Chairman. So the rule that was set up by Cadbury was that the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer, and the Chairman of the company could not be the same person. So we're going to look at that rule in detail later on in this lecture. The Chairman also has to be independent, and we're going to think about what independence means also in this lecture and look at why non-executive directors should be independent. The Higgs report then continued to add to these rules. It also said that the board should be made up of half non-executive directors and half executive directors. Remember, non-executive directors are there to provide an independent view. They're people without a business relationship or a personal relationship with that corporation. And they come in to sit on the board and help with setting the strategy, etc. So half of the board must be non-executive directors, and we'll talk in detail about non-executive directors later. There also needed to be appropriate remuneration, that was set out by Higgs also, and shareholder communication, both of which we're going to look at in later lectures. Tyson then went on to talk about the diversity of non-executive directors and why you should diversify those non-executive directors on your board. And again, we'll look at that when we're looking at non-executive directors. Also, Tyson set out that we should improve the communication, particularly between the board and the shareholders. So communication lines should remain open. So that's the development of the board. We then had recent changes. And this was in the FRC report in 2010. So we talked about this again in the last lecture. And this set out our new code. That's the UK Corporate Governance Code. So it used to be called the Combined Code. So some of the revisions that came in on this, first of all, the name changed. It's now called the UK Corporate Governance Code. Not a big change, but a change nonetheless. It also brought in some new sections that we'll look at, particularly surrounding leadership and leadership provision by the board. So that's important because this now sets out that the board should provide that leadership. Also, it talked about a few areas of effectiveness on the board. So some of those new principles that led to leadership and effectiveness on the board were, first of all, that the chairman has those leadership responsibilities. So we're going to talk later on in this lecture of exactly what the difference between the chairman and the chief executive officer is, and in that we'll look at the roles of each. The new principle in the FRC report in 2010 set out that the chairman has those leadership responsibilities for the board. Also, it set out that the non-executive directors should challenge the strategy set out by the business. So that means that the non-executive directors are coming in there, providing that independent view, but also challenging the strategy that's set out by the board, making sure that it's effective, making sure that it's in the interests of the shareholders. It also set out that there should be a balance of skills on the board. Now, this is important because it set out not only that the skills should be there on the board, but also that there should be a diversity on the board. So there should be a diversity that represents the society at large. So there should be that balance within the board. And also it set out time requirements, that timely information should be provided by the board. So those are some of the recent changes to the UK Corporate Governance Codes. The new principles also included that re-election of directors should occur annually rather than regularly. So re-elect the directors annually each and every year. So those were some of the new provisions in the UK Corporate Governance Code. Some of the provisions that have been there for a period of time, setting out, for example, the roles and responsibilities. And we remember here particularly looking at the board of directors. So what is the role of the board of directors? What are the various responsibilities that that board has? Well, number one, the board has responsibility for entrepreneurial leadership. So that means that the board is going to set the strategic direction of the firm. It's going to set the entrepreneurial leadership, how that business is going to make money. So that's going to be set by the board, and that then will feed down throughout the organisation in order that they can achieve the strategic objectives that they set. The board will also be required to represent the company to the public. So usually that will be the chairman. The chairman will usually be the face of the board, and they will represent the company to the public. But it's important that businesses manage their reputation carefully and deal in detail with shareholders and with stakeholders so that that company is represented accurately in the public view. They also are charged with determining the strategic aims of the organisation. So as I said, they have the entrepreneurial leadership. They also need to set that strategy. They need to determine what the organisation is trying to achieve, what the competitive advantage that the organisation has is, and therefore determine what the strategic aims of the firm are. They also should set the values and standards throughout the organisation. We'll talk about this whenever it comes to internal controls, because it's important that the directors set the tone of the organisation. So that tone will be set at the top. It's sometimes referred to as the control environment within an organisation. That is the responsibility of the directors. They need to set that tone and ensure that it feeds down throughout the organisation. Also, they will be responsible for overseeing management and making sure that management act accordingly. And they're responsible for establishing internal controls. So we'll be looking at internal controls in detail in this module. Just remember that that is the responsibility of the board. They need to establish those internal controls to prevent fraud and error. If they're not there, then that's the responsibility of the board. They also have to meet regularly, don't forget that. That would generally be once a month rather than once a quarter or anything like that. So regular meetings must occur. And there must be a performance assessment. Again, we'll look at this when we're looking at the remuneration of directors. The remuneration must be set based on their performance. If we don't assess their performance, then how can we do that? So there must be a mechanism for assessing the performance of the directors. And as I've already mentioned, they must be re-elected each and every year annually. So that re-election of directors must happen on an annual basis. So that's the roles and responsibilities of the board. What about actually running the board then? So to be effective, the board must do various things. Number one, they must set and drive a clear strategy. Well, we know that they're responsible for that. We know they're responsible for the entrepreneurial leadership and determining the strategic aims. So they must bring that to the boardroom. They must set and drive a clear strategy and force that through to enable competitive advantage to be achieved. They also set the key performance indicators within the organisation. So they'll decide how we actually assess how the business has performed. And they must consider the stakeholders. So they must think about the various stakeholders that will be affected by the decisions that are made at a board level. And again, we'll look in detail at a stakeholder analysis later on in this module. So they must think about those stakeholders, think about the impact, and think about how to manage the relationship with those stakeholders. As I've already mentioned, there must be an evaluation of performance because that's how their pay is going to be set. However, there are things that may be problems in actually making an effective board. Number one, the non-executive directors rely on management. Remember, non-executive directors are independent. They don't actually work within the organisation on a day-to-day basis, so they rely on management to give them appropriate information on which to make their assessment and to base their decisions. So they're reliant on that information coming from management. Also, there are only occasional meetings, once a month as I mentioned, so that's not a meeting every day where you can really decide what's going on in the organisation on a day-to-day basis and take corrective action should there be any problems. So only having occasional meetings can cause problems in running an effective board. Also, you may have an overbearing CEO. The Chief Executive Officer, remember, is the man in charge of the executive function. They will set the strategy ultimately. If they're an overbearing person, well then it may be difficult for the board to overcome that, for the board to keep that in check. And that may well reduce board effectiveness. That board will then meet on a regular basis. So when they run these meetings, how does that actually work? Well, they'll have an agenda to approve decisions, so they'll decide what they're going to discuss during those board meetings. That agenda will be followed, and before they go to the meetings, information will be distributed throughout to all of the board members. That will generally be done by the chairman, because remember, the chairman runs the board. Don't forget that those meetings must be regular and they must be attended. Non-attendance at meetings on a persistent way is grounds for removal of a director. So the meetings must be regular and the directors must attend them. There are also two different types of board structure that we need to be aware of. The first of them is called a two-tier board. Now, this structure is often seen in Europe and Japan, and what we have here are two different boards. The first board, the management board, well, they're in charge of the executive function of the organisation. These guys actually run the business on a day-to-day basis. They make the strategic decisions, they take the executive decisions. However, there's also then the supervisory board, and this supervisory board oversees the management board. They're in charge of corporate governance. So in that way, we have two different boards, both charged with a separate function, as opposed to in the UK and the US, where we have a unitary board. As I said, we have this in the UK, we have it in the US, and this board is combined, so they take collective responsibility. The board here is responsible both for the executive function and for the non-executive function. So they take collective responsibility for those decisions, and they don't have an oversight board. Who then will be on the board? Well, we have executive directors who work within the organisation, and we have non-executive directors. Remember, non-executive directors are on the board to provide an independent view. And the rules in the UK Corporate Governance Code are that we must have half and half for non-executive directors and executive directors on the board of large companies, or at least two non-executive directors in a small company. So what do these non-executive directors do? Well, what they'll do is they will help us to set the strategy. We will appoint non-executive directors that have sufficient business knowledge to help us with this. We're not just going to appoint anybody as a non-executive director. They're going to have expertise. So because they have that expertise, we can use them to help us with the strategy. They will be able to advise the board on current strategy or future strategy and evaluate how that strategy is being implemented. They also provide us with a scrutinising role. Remember, these guys will also sit on various committees that we'll look at throughout the rest of this module, such as the Remuneration Committee, the Audit Committee, also the Nomination Committee. So they can scrutinise what the board is doing. They can oversee to a certain extent what the executive directors within the board are doing. They can also help us to manage risk. Again, there is a temptation for the executive directors to take a lot of risk, to try and make short-term gains in order to get bonuses, etc. Well, the non-executive directors can provide a risk management role. They can help to manage that risk, to reduce the amount of risk that shareholders will be exposed to. And also when it comes to people, they can help for nominations. For example, in finding new directors. Non-executive directors will often sit on the nominations committee, and that nominations committee will appoint new directors. Therefore, non-executive directors can help us to get the correct people within the organisation. So how can we ensure that these non-executive directors will be effective? Well, there's several things that they will need to have. Number one, they'll need to have sufficient knowledge. We don't just appoint non-executive directors because, for example, they are celebrities. They need to have sufficient knowledge in the business area that we are involved in so that they can help us in setting the strategy for the organisation. They also need to insist on an induction process. So from the point of view of the exam, look for a scenario where there is no induction process for non-executive directors. They need to be introduced to the business. They need to be involved in actually what the business does. And to do that, they need to know exactly what is happening. So they need to have that induction that teaches them. They need to know the issues that the business is facing, so they'll need to be informed on a regular basis. They'll also need to demand information. If information isn't forthcoming from the organisation, well then the non-executive director needs to take the initiative. They need to ask the board for that information that they need, and in that way become informed. Non-executive directors must always act in an ethical way, and we'll look in detail at ethics towards the end of this module. There are some threats to the independence of non-executive directors and things that we need to be aware of. Non-executive directors should not have been an employee of the business in the last 5 years. That's a big threat to independence. So we shouldn't be appointing non-executive directors that have been employees of the business within the last 5 years. Also, other directorships, particularly if our non-executive director is a director of our business and another, and a director of that business is also a director of our business. That's called a cross-directorship. So we don't want that. That's an example of back scratching. You be a non-executive director in our business and we'll be a non-executive director in yours. That shouldn't happen. So other directorships will reduce the independence of your non-executive directors. Also, they shouldn't be a major shareholder in the business, so that shouldn't be the case. And they shouldn't have other remuneration from the business. We shouldn't be paying them for anything else, such as consultancy within the organisation. So look out for those threats in a scenario. Let's have a look now at these issues in a scenario-based question. So illustration 1, read through the scenario, maybe have a go at the answer if you want, and then learn from the answer that we go through together, because this will give you examples of independence of non-executive directors and some of the issues that are likely to come up in a question. The requirement in illustration 1 is to explain the term conflict of interest in the context of non-executive directors and discuss the potential conflicts of interest relating to KKK and Soria Supplies if John Soria were to become a non-executive director of KKK Limited. So the first thing to do is explain the conflict of interest. Then we need to see in the detail of the scenario what potential conflicts there are here. So firstly, conflict of interest. What is this? So a conflict of interest is a situation where independence is questionable due to another interest either declared or undeclared. So we talked about how we need to maintain the independence of non-executive directors in the lecture. So a conflict of interest is where that independence is questioned because you've got another interest that you've declared or maybe you haven't declared. In the case of non-executive directors, shareholders have the right to expect each non-executive director to act wholly in the shareholders' interests while serving the company. Any other factors that might challenge this is likely to give rise to a conflict of interest. So if there's anything happening that would challenge the shareholders' interests and the effectiveness of the non-executive director to uphold those, then that is going to be a problem. That is going to be a conflict of interest. So let's see if we have any of these in the case. John, as we've said, is trying to be nominated as a non-executive director, and he has a long-standing and current material business relationship with KKK Limited because he's the CEO of the largest supplier. This creates an obvious incentive to influence purchases from Soria over and above other competitor suppliers. So we said earlier that we need to be careful if we have a business relationship because that could affect the independence of non-executive directors. So there's a very clear business relationship here that would need to be considered. It's in the interests of KK shareholders for inputs to be purchased from whichever supplier is offering the best in terms of quality, price and supply. And that may or may not be Soria Supplies. So that may be a problem when it comes to John being a non-executive director. He will obviously want Soria to be used If they're not, then he may not be happy about it. Similarly, a conflict of interest already exists in that Susan Schwab, the finance director, is a non-executive director on Soria Supplies already, and that's a material business relationship. So John's appointment, if we approved it, would create a cross-directorship, because she was appointed to their board. Any appointment from their board to ours is going to be a cross-directorship, and that's a big problem. We shouldn't have cross-directorships, as we mentioned in the lecture. So those are some of the main conflicts of interest that we can see in that particular scenario. Now that we understand the importance of the independence of non-executive directors, let's have a look, as we said we would, at the chairman stroke CEO role and why they must be split. So remember, the roles of both the chairman and the CEO are as follows. So the chairman, first of all, the chairman runs the board. So this is likely to be the public face of the organisation. They're going to provide that leadership on the board. That means that they're going to be responsible for structuring the board, and they're going to set the agenda for the meetings. So once the chairman has set the agenda, that will be distributed to all of the other members of the board. The chairman will also be responsible for facilitating the non-executive directors. What that means is that the chairman will provide them with the information that they require. Now that's important because we said that if the non-executive directors feel that they're not getting enough information, they need to demand that from the organisation, and that will come from the chairman. So the chairman will provide that leadership. They'll make sure that the board is structured correctly. They'll set the agenda so that the meeting runs smoothly and ensure that all of the information is distributed to the board members. As opposed to the Chief Executive Officer, remember the Chief Executive Officer works within the business on a day-to-day basis, whereas the chairman will just come in for those board meetings. The CEO therefore runs the company. They're responsible for running the company on that day-to-day basis. How do they do that? Well, they'll do things like developing the policy and the strategy as we discussed. So they'll set the strategic direction of the firm and ensure that they're achieving competitive advantage. They'll be accountable for that policy and strategy. So they'll take the fall if there's a problem. They'll also need to manage the resources in the firm. So they'll need to get daily reports on how resources are being managed and ensure that things are done correctly. They'll do that by supervising the management that are below them. So they'll make sure that that management team is implementing the strategy correctly as it's been set. And they'll also review the budget and the finance areas within the organisation. So basically the CEO is responsible for the executive function within the organisation. They set the strategic direction and they make sure that that strategic direction is followed. So as we said, these two roles must be split under the UK Corporate Governance Code, and you can see now why that would be the case. That's the case because the chairman represents the shareholders. The chairman runs the board. The chairman is non-executive. They're there to provide that function of making sure that the board is there to oversee the business. They also make sure that there's clear accountability. So by having the split between the chairman and the chief executive, it ensures that there's no unfettered power within the organisation that could be abused. If one person did each role, they could basically do what they liked. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail using an illustration. So illustration 2, read through the scenario that you're given. We have just a simple part A to do, and then we're going to look in detail in part B at the split of the role between the chairman and the chief executive. So maybe you want to have a go at the question and then work through it with me, but remember, we're going to use this to learn more, to really get into the detail of this area. The first requirement in illustration 2 is to explain the roles of the chairman in corporate governance. So this is just to show that we don't always have to relate it to the scenario. This is simple book knowledge. We need to know the roles of the chairman and be able to explain them. So the roles that we have here for the chairman in corporate governance. First of all, the chairman is the leader of the board of directors in a private or public company, although other organisations are often run along similar governance lines, as we've already seen looking at charitable organisations. In this role, he or she is responsible for ensuring the board's effectiveness as a unit in the service of the shareholders. This means agreeing and, if necessary, setting the board's agenda and ensuring that the board meetings take place on a regular basis, both the requirements, as we saw, and both the responsibility of the chairman. The chairman also represents the company to investors and other outside shareholders, stakeholders, constituents. He or she is often the public face of the organisation, especially if the organisation must account for itself in a public manner, i.e. if it's listed. So the chairman often represents the organisation. Linked to this, the chairman's roles include communication with shareholders. That'll be in the annual report, where they may write to the shareholders every year, and at annual and extraordinary general meetings. So that's where the chairman will actually communicate to the shareholders directly. Internally, the chairman ensures that the directors receive relevant information in advance of board meetings so that all discussions and decisions are made by directors fully appraised of the situation under discussion. So we said that in the lecture. They make sure that all of that information is provided to the directors so that they can make the correct decision. Finally, his or her role extends to coordinating the contributions of non-executive directors and facilitating good relationships between executive and non-executive directors. So they'll facilitate that relationship and ensure that it runs smoothly. So those are the roles of the chairman in corporate governance. Our second requirement of illustration 2 is that we have to assess the benefits of the separation of the roles of chief executive and chairman, and explain her belief that accountability to shareholders is increased by separation of these roles. So we're going to split this up. We're going to look first of all at the benefits, and then we're going to look at the accountability. So first of all, the benefits of the separation of the roles. So we thought about this when we were looking in the lecture at this separation. So the separation of the roles offers the benefit that it frees up the chief executive to fully concentrate on the management of the organisation without the necessity to report to shareholders or otherwise become distracted from his or her executive responsibilities. So the chief executive can focus on those executive responsibilities and leave the chairman to deal with those other issues, to deal with the board and to report to shareholders and to be the public face of the organisation. The arrangement provides a position, which is that of chairman, that is expected to represent shareholders' interests and that is the point of contact into the company for shareholders, as we discussed when we looked at the role of the chairman. So having two people rather than one at the head of a large organisation removes the risks of unfettered powers being concentrated in a single individual. And this is an important safeguard for investors concerned with excessive secrecy or lack of transparency and accountability. All of these terms we've met so far. So we don't want just one person to have all of those powers, power over the board and power over the executive function in the organisation. So having the two roles separated reduces the risk of a conflict of interest in a single person being responsible for company performance whilst also reporting on that performance to markets. So the chairman's going to report the performance to the markets, whereas the CEO is responsible for that performance. Finally, the chairman provides a conduit for the concerns of non-executive directors, who in turn provide an important external representation of external concerns on the board of directors, i.e. the non-executive directors are there to hold the board to account, and the chairman facilitates that. They can bring their concerns to the chairman, and he can be that communicative option between the non-executive and the executive director. Remember, as we said, that that's one of the responsibilities of the chairman. So those are the benefits. What about this accountability and the separation of the roles? Well, there's a few areas to look at here. In terms of the separation of the roles assisting in the accountability to shareholders, there's 4 points we're going to look at. Number 1, the chairman scrutinises the chief executive management's performance on behalf of the shareholders. So he looks at how they've performed. Therefore, they'll be involved in approving the design of the chief executive's reward package. So it's the responsibility of the chairman to hold the chief executive to account on the shareholders' behalf. So the shareholders will be told by the chairman how the chief executive is performing, and the chief executive's rewards will be based on that. Shareholders will also have an identified person in the chairman to hold accountable for the performance of their investment, whilst the day-to-day contact will be with the investor relations department, and they can ultimately hold the chairman to account, even though that day-to-day contact will just be with the investor relations department. There's a face there that they can hold accountable. The presence of a separate chairman also ensures that a system is in place to ensure that the non-executive directors have someone to report to outside the executive structure. So the chairman is going to be a non-executive director themselves, so they're not within the executive structure of the organisation. So that's going to encourage the freedom of expression of the non-executive directors to the chairman, and this in turn enables the issues to be raised and acted upon when necessary. So if there are issues that come up, the non-executive directors can take them straight to the chairman, safe in the knowledge that they are independent from the executive function of the business. Lastly, the chairman is legally accountable and in most cases an experienced person. So he or she can be independent and more dispassionate because they're not ultimately involved with day-to-day management issues. So they're not involved with those day-to-day management issues. That will increase the independence that they give to the shareholders and the non-executive directors. That then was our lecture looking at the board of directors.